Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Here we are for lesson 6 in semester 2 in psychology. And I think this lesson will be one that interests you. This tends to be the type of, or at least the part of the class that a lot of students are really interested in. And that's when we take a look at the psychological disorders. So, we talked a lot about defining psychology, what kind of normal psychology is, how the brain works, how people function. And now we're going to take a look at what happens when things are not working appropriately. What are some of the different types of disorders that people suffer with? What are the types? How are they diagnosed? And what can be done to assist those kind of people? So we're going to take a look at that today. As part of the lesson here too this week, I think you're going to enjoy the case study. It's going to give you an opportunity to actually be a psychologist, and you're going to get a whole bunch of information about a person suffering from some sort of mental distress, and you have to diagnose that disorder. It's going to be one of the disorders that we talk about on the lesson this week, and then also on this particular video. So if you take a few notes as we go through with the different disorders, I think you'll find that it makes that case study a little more fun and easy. All right, so let's go ahead and start off by taking a look at a spotlight disorder. And this one is a very interesting disorder. This is called Munchausen syndrome by proxy. That's a lot of big, heavy-duty words. Munchausen is the name of the scientist, psychologist who actually came up with the name of the syndrome, so that's all that means. And by proxy means somebody else who is bringing the syndrome to a person. So the person that has the mental disorder is actually not the one suffering in this case. And it's a very interesting case, and generally involves parents and children. So let me walk through this with you. So the Munchausen syndrome by proxy is a disorder in which a caregiver, so think about a parent, or maybe somebody who's caring for an elderly person or something like that, will intentionally make another person ill. Now, why on earth would you intentionally make another person ill? Well, the disorder in the person that's making the other individual ill is that they need attention. They need the attention of other people. So by making, for example, a child ill, the parent can continually be going into the hospital, working with people, having their self-worth activated by the importance of them being able to care for this person, even though they're the one who initially made them ill. They also, if ultimately the person gets better, if they stop making them ill, then the sufferer gets to appear to have saved the victim and can play the role of hero. Oh, look what you did. Your child was so ill, and yet you worked tirelessly, and now they're doing well. So this is a very controversial syndrome as well, and experts are not 100% sure if this is a mental disorder in the person or if it's more of just a form of child abuse by the individual who's inflicting this kind of illness on another person. But it certainly is an interesting concept, and one that pops up every now and then with like Child and Protective Services will have to ultimately take the child from this person until they get support so that they don't hurt them anymore. Okay, when we talk about psychological disorders, the first thing we have to do is, how do we identify somebody having disorder? The tricky part is that a disorder in general, think about a physical disorder. When you have a cold, how do we know you have a cold? Well, you're not feeling as well as you normally would. Your normal physical health has been compromised somehow. So psychologists try to use that same idea to try to define what a psychological disorder is. They try to figure out what normal mental behavior is, and then someone who is deviating from that normal behavior is considered to be mentally ill. The tricky part, of course, is that there's a lot of normal. Your normal and my normal and your friend's normal are all very different. We all act and behave a little bit differently. It's when we go away from that normal line that we start to run into potentially mental illness. But it's really tricky, because just being different, having a different idea, a different slant on life, a different way of behaving, obviously does not mean that you have a disorder. That's oftentimes means that you're creative, or that you're thinking outside the box, or things that we would suggest are good things. So we have to be very careful to not slap some terms on people who just behave a little bit differently. So the real, as I said before, the real definition involves the deviation from normality. If we think of all the people that can function in daily life, can get up, take care of themselves, get to their job or school, have that level of functionality, that is considered in our society to be normal. Somebody who deviates from that is considered abnormal and potentially is mentally ill. Another definition involves being able to adjust. So as times change, as the situation changes, can a person adjust to their new surroundings? And that we would suggest that a normal person can, an abnormal person cannot. The tricky part is we also have to include cultural norms. And what that means is that to be an American, or to be somebody in Western Europe that's very similar to America, has one definition of normal. In other parts of the world, they have different definitions of normal, and different cultures have different ways of behaving that we would look at and say, wow, that's really freaky. But to them, it's normal. So we have to take those into account before we start to say, oop, they're abnormal and potentially mentally ill. So it's a bit tricky. So what the collective group of psychologists did was to attempt to streamline and classify mental illness. They're difficult to do because they present themselves in very unique ways. And so everybody who is a little abnormal, as we talked about in the previous slide, may look a little different than everybody else. And so psychologists have developed a manual called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or the DSM. The DSM is a big old book that tries to walk scientists, physicians, psychologists through the process of classifying and diagnosing people suffering from mental illness. And it tries to do it in such a way that it's consistent. So every single time a person that has these symptoms and is suffering from this disorder will be classified as such. So we're trying to take the guesswork out of it a little bit. The DSM is actually being rewritten, and the new issue is number 5, edition is number 5, and it's coming out very soon, and it will change a little bit. But generally what the diagnosis in the DSM does is it tries to look at what are the essential features of the disorder. So what are the things on outwardly present themselves that we can take a look at? What are some differential diagnoses that we might have? So what are some things that we could improperly diagnose somebody in? What are some things that are very much like it? In other words, like the disorder that they're suffering from. And what is the diagnostic criteria? So what do psychologists have to look at when they're making that diagnosis? So they use all these different categories to try to classify what a person is suffering for. And again, the whole point of this is to help to ensure that a patient will be diagnosed consistently and correctly, regardless of who is making the diagnosis. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go through, for the remainder of this presentation, some of the different psychological disorders. And these are the ones that people have, that they're fairly common in terms of mental illness. And we'll talk a little bit about the types, we'll talk about some of the subtypes, but the main themes here are the ones that we're going to talk about. So the very first kind of type of psychological disorder that we're going to look at are called anxiety disorders. So anxiety, and we've all felt anxiety, is a general state of dread in response to a real or imagined danger, or, as we used in the previous lesson, a stressor. So if we have a stressor, if stress is put on us and we are anxious, we're worried, we're fearful about something, that means we have anxiety. Now, everybody has anxiety. What people that are, again, thought to be healthy in terms of their mental state can do is they can manage it. They can manage the anxiety so it doesn't take over their lives. People that have an anxiety disorder are the other side of that coin. They're suffering from this and cannot manage their anxiety. It's leading into a number of different things that allow them or are not allowing them to live a normal life. About 15% of adults around the world suffer from some type of an anxiety disorder. That's a lot. So that's 15 out of 100, if you want to think about that, or 1.5 out of 10. That's a big chunk of people that are suffering from some sort of a clinical anxiety disorder. Whether it's being diagnosed or not, we don't know, but that's a lot of people that are really suffering with something. Anxiety disorders can lead to a number of different things. Some of the common things are physical symptoms. You can get headaches, sweating, weakness, panic attacks, which we'll talk about in a minute. It's difficult to form relationships. It's difficult to get out and do your normal routine. All those things happen to people that are suffering from an anxiety disorder. So let's take a look at the types of anxiety disorders that people suffer with. The first one is called generalized anxiety disorder. And as the term would suggest, generalized, there's nothing specific here, but what it is just a continuous cycle of anxiety. and it's often leading to a panic attack. What that means is that where you and I might be anxious, might be worried, might be fearful, and then it goes away after a situation goes away. We're having to make a speech in class. We're worried about it. We're nervous about it. We get up, we do the speech, we sit down, it's over. That would be a normal way to respond to anxiety. People with generalized anxiety disorder, that's not it. It's just continuous throughout their lives, regardless of what's going on. They're feeling anxious. A phobic disorder is a little different. That's where a person is anxious about a particular object or activity. So one particular thing sets them off. So I'll give you a few examples here. One that's not on this list would be arachnophobia. There's been a movie by that title, and it's about being fearful of spiders or an arachnid. But some of the common ones of phobias that people suffer from are things like aerophobia. That's the fear of flying. There's a lot of people that refuse to get onto an airplane, even though every single statistic suggests that it's very, very safe. They're not doing it. They're fearful of it. Claustrophobia. That's the fear of a confined space. So getting into an elevator, getting into a small room, getting into a packed car leads to claustrophobia. And the number one phobia that people suffer for, interestingly enough, is called glossophobia. Glossophobia is the fear of public speaking, which is the most fearful thing that people can do. On every single survey that people do, they're most fearful of getting up and speaking in front of a group. So those are some anxieties, and the phobic individual would then have a panic attack based on those things. So it's not just, ooh, I'm a little nervous about flying on the plane, but I'll get on and I'll deal with it. This is to the point where they cannot function. A panic disorder, the next bullet down, is where a sudden or helpless terror is leading to that panic attack. So something hits instantaneously, and maybe sometimes without even a trigger, and all of a sudden we're into the cycle of a panic attack with that person. A really common anxiety disorder is called obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD. And people that suffer from OCD are repeatedly thinking or acting on something over and over and over. And oftentimes it shows up as that they're obsessively health freaks, or they're worried about germs, or they turn off and on the light, or they have to drive back to the house to see if they lock the door, or they're just completely focused on something over and over. That would be something called obsessive compulsive disorder. And I'm going to give you, as we go through these, some examples that in kind of pop culture, TV and movies, that you can take a look at if you're interested, just kind of see what people might look like that are suffering from this disorder. So the first one is from a TV show. I'm not sure if it's on anymore, but it's probably in reruns. I'm sure you can find it. It was a show called Monk, and it's about a detective who suffers from OCD as he's going through his day. So you can take a look at that, and if you're interested, go pull that up, see an example, and that'll be a good example of someone who's suffering from OCD. Somatoform disorders are another category, along with anxiety disorders. This is where there's a physical symptom for which there's no apparent physical cause. So somebody who's suffering from that thinks that they're sick, even though a medical doctor would say there's nothing wrong with you. And there's a couple of classic examples of this. Conversion disorder is where when people are suffering emotionally or psychologically, mentally from something, they convert that into the loss of physical functioning. So all of a sudden somebody who is suffering with this conversion disorder can no longer walk, or says they can no longer walk, or they can no longer see, or they can no longer hear. And there's no medical reason for them not to. They've just got a mental block. That's called conversion disorder. A more common one that most of you have probably heard about is called hypochondriasis. And the person who suffers from that is called a hypochondriac. You may have heard that term before. So a hypochondriac is a person who's in good health, but becomes preoccupied by imaginary ailments, is always considering themselves to be sick, even though they're not. They might go into the emergency room multiple times over the course of a week. The doctor can't find anything wrong with them because it's in their head. And both of these disorders, the conversion and the hypochondriac state, are disorders that are based on the repression of emotions. So we've got something emotionally going on, something mentally going on, and it's being expressed physically. So some sort of therapy is usually the way that we try to help folks with somatoform disorders. The next one would be called dissociative disorders. And dissociative disorder is where there's a breakdown in a person's normal conscious experience. Okay, so what we normally see the world, how we normally interact with the world, when we have a dissociative disorder, people are breaking down. And there's several different ones here, and you've probably heard of the last one when we get to it. The first one, though, we're going to talk about is dissociative amnesia. Amnesia, of course, is memory loss, and amnesia can have a number of different medical reasons. You can have some sort of a trauma to the brain that can lead to amnesia. But in this type of amnesia, it's where there's a memory loss with no physical explanation. And generally what's happening is that some sort of a problem or a trauma is being blocked out. And we talked about that earlier in the class, and how people can absolutely just block themselves out from things that are so traumatic that they don't even want to deal with it. Something perhaps of abusive nature. A dissociative fugue, which is the second bullet here, is where you have amnesia with flight to a new location. And this is really interesting. So somebody who is suffering, again, from some sort of a psychological or emotional problem will black out, will have amnesia, and will kind of reappear, miles, a state, a continent away with no idea how that happened. And this can happen for days and for decades. And during this state, they're still functional. They're able to get onto a bus or onto a plane or a train or drive a car and do all these things, but they have totally disconnected from their normal reality and don't know who they are during that time. And when they come back to their normalcy, they can't describe what happened to them. The last one, dissociative identity disorder, this used to be called multiple personality disorder, and this is one that I'm sure you've probably heard about. This is where you have two or more identities that are kind of living inside your mind. So your mind is broken up. Oftentimes each individual identity has a particular focus. So one might be the identity when you're angry, one might be the identity when you're sad. A number of different identities play themselves out through one body, and people don't know what's happening. They can't describe what's happening when they move from one personality to the next. This is usually in a person who suffered from some sort of a severe physical, emotional, or sexual abuse is leading to this. And there's a couple of real good examples. A fairly recent movie from maybe 10 years ago or so called Primal Fear with Edward Norton and Richard Gere is a real good movie for this. And then an old movie back from the 50s called The Three Faces of Eve is kind of the classic. So either of those two movies would give you a good image of what a dissociative identity disorder or multiple personality disorder looks like. Okay, the next main type of mental illness is called schizophrenia. And schizophrenia is confused or disconnected thoughts, emotions, perceptions, and actions. And so when things are happening that are well outside of the norm, and the person has no control of them, potentially schizophrenia is the issue. And this can look like a lot of different things. It can be that the person suffers from delusions, seeing things that aren't there. Hallucinations, very similar. Incoherence, has the inability to speak in normal patterns of speech. Unnatural movement, this may be a person may be catatonic or completely rigid for long periods of time, or moving in strange and odd ways. This is kind of the classic. When you think of like a mental institution, if you have kind of an image of folks that are in a mental institution, an awful lot of times what those people are suffering from would be a schizophrenia type disorder. A great example from just a few years ago with Russell Crowe in it is a movie called A Beautiful Mind, which tells the real story of a scientist who studied or who suffered from schizophrenia and what he did to try to combat it. So I would definitely recommend it. It's also a really good movie, so you should check it out anyway. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about schizophrenia. There's several different types of schizophrenia. The first is paranoid schizophrenia. That's where you have hallucinations and delusions with feelings of being watched, observed from afar. So that is somebody's watching me, somebody's keeping track of me. It might be the government, it might be a foreign agent, it might be that there's a spy trying to get me, there's an evil person trying to get me. That would be paranoid schizophrenia. Catatonic schizophrenia is where a person may remain completely motionless for long periods of time, may just kind of freeze into a particular position with no particular reason and may pop out of it at any given time. Disorganized schizophrenia is where a person may have incoherent language we can't understand, maybe words we understand, but they don't fit together in sentence patterns. incoherent emotions. We're up, we're down, we're all over the map in terms of our emotions, and our movement is really disorganized too. In remission schizophrenia, that's where the person is still schizophrenic, but they are not suffering or not suffering much from the different things, the different types of characterizations. And so they're able to function. That may be because they've had some chemical or some emotional support that helps them get into a remission state. With schizophrenia, scientists have found that there's a strong genetic link. It tends to be passed down from family. If someone in your family has schizophrenia, you have a higher chance of getting it. Doesn't mean 100% chance by any stretch of the imagination, but a higher chance than somebody who doesn't. And generally, schizophrenia seems to be because there's some chemical imbalance in the brain. And so usually there's a drug-related therapy that is included in helping those folks that are suffering from schizophrenia. The last type last type of disorder we're going to talk about is what's called mood disorders. And there's several of these, and again, you probably have heard of some of these as well. The first one is major depressive disorder. Mood disorders generally involve a mood swing. So you're either very, very up, happy, elated, or you're very, very down, where you're depressed. And the major depressive disorder is the depressed type, the severe depression that interferes with normal functioning. And this is to a point where you're not just depressed like most normal folks are depressed from time to time. Things aren't going right. I lost my job. I did poorly on the test. I'm breaking up with my girlfriend or boyfriend, whatever it is. Those are depressed. We're all depressed from time to time. These are people that literally the depression is eating into their daily routine. So they can't eat, they can't sleep, they can't care for themselves, they can't make decisions, and potentially they're suicidal. So those, when it gets to that level, that would be a clinical depressive disorder. Bipolar disorder, which also used to be called manic depressive disorder, is where people are either excessively happy in what's called a manic phase, or are incredibly unhappy, which is when they're in a depressed stage. So let's talk a little bit about what that looks like. When a person is up, when they're happy in the manic phase, it's not normal happiness. It's happiness that is characterized by extreme elation, extreme confusion. Thoughts can be racing. They can be physically moving very, very fast. That would be manic, doing a lot of things over and over. Looks like they're highly caffeinated, potentially. The depressive phase, which is the other side that people suffer from when they crash, is they have feelings of failure, feelings of worthlessness, and utter despair. So a good example, and this one just came out this last year, and a matter of fact was a big winner for the Academy Awards, is a movie called Silver Linings Playbook. So if you didn't have a chance to see that in the theater, it should be coming out, I would imagine, to like Redbox and Netflix and things like that pretty soon. If you have a chance, definitely see Silver Linings Playbook. It gives a really good example of what the bipolar disorder looks like. And then the last mood disorder we're going to talk about is kind of interesting, and it's one that I certainly know a lot about, not because I suffer from it, but because it happens in a place where I grew up, is something called seasonal affective disorder, or SAD is the acronym, SAD. And this is where you have depression in the middle of winter or very, very dark, dreary periods. And so I grew up in Alaska, and for 20 hours a day in the middle of the winter, it would be dark. It would be dark, it would be cold, it would be dreary oftentimes. And people that suffered from seasonal affective disorder would be horrifically depressed because of that. They feel locked in, they feel trapped, they feel it's never going to get nice again. And oftentimes they think this is a chemical imbalance. They don't have enough sunshine that's providing them the vitamins and chemicals that they need. And so it's triggering this problem. So seasonal affective disorder is one that you see a lot, especially in the mountain states, the western states, rainy states, northern climes. If you're in Alaska or Canada or Russia, we have a lot of this suffering because of this, for that reason. Okay? We're going to finish off on, unfortunately, a very, very sad topic, and that is suicide and depression. And there's definitely a connection between suicide and mental illness. When people feel ultimate despair, generally it's going to lead them to ask questions about what on earth am I doing this for? Why wouldn't it be just easier? Wouldn't I be better off if I just ended it? And so depressed people can consider suicide as a way to escape from the physical and, more importantly, emotional and psychological pain that they're feeling. And unfortunately, over 30,000 people commit suicide each year in the United States. And when you think about that, that's a huge number of people. That's the same number of people that has died by gunfire. So, that's a lot of folks that are killing themselves, probably because for a reason that could be rectified. It's either something going on in their life or something maybe that's just a chemical issue, that if they could get some support and some help and some therapy, they would be better. So it's definitely something we need to work on as a society much better. A couple interesting statistics about it. More women attempt suicide than men, which is a bit of a surprise. I think we think of this as more something that men tend to do, but more men are successful in ending their life. So men follow through to the ultimate of actually committing suicide more than women do, but more women attempt. A threat of suicide should be taken very seriously. It's definitely a cry for help. There's something going on with that individual that needs some support. So if they're having suicidal thoughts, suicidal discussions, if you hear of a friend, you need to let someone know right away. Let a teacher know, let a nurse know, let an adult know, so that they can get that person some support. The graph here, or the map on the right-hand side of this particular slide, is kind of interesting because you'll see as the color gets darker into finally the dark red, that's the number of people, the more people that are committing suicide in those particular states. So if you look at Alaska, which of course is not placed right on the map, but you know where it really is, it's very dark red because people are suffering from that seasonal affective disorder. If you look at the West, there's a lot of people there too, and that may be some of that too. So you can take a look at this map and see if you can find any kind of correlation between where people commit suicide and what might be some environmental factors that lead to that. So that's our discussion. I hope that you will enjoy this particular lesson. It's really interesting, and I think it's probably what a lot of people get into psychology for, is trying to figure out why people behave in an abnormal way. And so once you're done watching this, please work through your way through the textbook as usual. Pay extra attention this week to the case study. I really do think you're going to enjoy it. You get to pretend to be a psychologist and do some diagnosing based on this information that we've talked about today. Thanks.